Before we start, obviously we're talking about decolonial. And someone mentioned something very interesting, that colonial process hasn't finished. It's not post. We're still in the process. And one of my countries that I focused on for my PhD was Palestine. And I just wanted to acknowledge what's happening there. I know sometimes we're scared to. I'm not affiliated with any university, so no one can fire me. So I can say it on behalf of anyone else, that acknowledge what's happening there, and we pray hopefully that ends soon, so that what we discuss in theory is happening in real life, and people can go back to their lives, and hopefully that will end soon. Right, so I just wanted to start with this is basically a lot of data that I managed to pull for my PhD. And the main processes I used for the framework were Orientalism and Stuart Hall's representation, and aspects of Joseph Nye's soft power. And these are things that all come together to kind of become the face of colonialism. You have the military, you have the capital, and media, and especially Hollywood becomes the face of it. And so we were just, discussing just earlier about why is it that Bollywood, bigger audience numbers and public box office, but that's never discussed. Is because they don't have the might of the US empire behind pushing it through all different means, be it academic and cultural and political and stuff like that. And so maybe the English language also being the kind of like empire language that became the dominant language enables also the process of making Hollywood the main area of study for film studies. So through my presentation, I'm going to go through methodology of what methodology I use and what methodology I invented, the formula that I invented that I'm going to try and pass on to everyone here if they like to use for collating in an empirical way in a content analysis of representation. And then we'll do some case studies with four countries that I had in mind, and then quick kind of like conclusion of it. So 61 sampled films, all through 1979 to 2019, all through the major Hollywood studios. So I decided to put aside independent films, not because they're less valuable, but because, as you know, for PhD, it's always very specific. You have to narrow it down. And so 85%, 86% of films released or revenues generated were from the Hollywood 6-7 studios, so I focused on those. And out of that time period, I managed to get 14 films that represent or depict or reference Afghanistan, 17 for Iran, 24 for Iraq, and 13 for Palestine. And interestingly, for Iraq, there was no films referencing Iraq until 1991. Or was it 1990? 1990, when Hot Shots came out, which was a parody of Tom Cruise's Top Gun. And it was just about to begin the war of 1991, the first Persian Gulf War, where they were kicking Saddam's troops out of Kuwait. So it kind of coincided with that, nothing about Iraq before that. So I wanted to have a formula where I can collate replicable data that if anyone else does the same thing comes to the same result. And so I sat down for about a year and a half until I managed to figure out this formula, which enabled me to kind of put any film into it, and at the end comes out the same result no matter who does it. And so, I needed levels of representation that could be quantified, and then using critical discourse analysis, contextualized to see in depth, what's going on. And so I went through the films and I noticed 4 patterns. One is films that only reference an identity, but never show it. Second one is there's minimal depiction where they could be in the background, but they're not party to the film, to the plot, to the characters, to the story. Third one is they interact with the main characters or the story, but they're not significant to the story. So if you take them out, it won't necessarily make a difference. The story isn't based around them. And level 4 is essential. That means if you take the story, you take the identity out of that story, there is no story. So for example, if you take the identity of Iran or Iranian out of Argo, there is no film because it's literally based about going to, or if you take the identity of Afghanistan out of the Kite Runner, there is no story because it's based around that. So those are the 4. And then once you have those, and then I had other units. So I would, for example, say, does this film depict a positive representation of female character from Afghanistan? So as I watched the film, if it had one, you put it in, the time and whatever. And then we'll get to the results of what that was, because that was very fascinating as well. My aim wasn't to look at female representation, we just look at a representation of different kinds of things. I just managed, my supervisor just mentioned, just collate as much as you can. Some of it you may refer to, some of it you won't. And some of it I didn't go too deeply for the PhD, but I realized later on that they're useful data that can be used to kind of analyze Hollywood films. That, interestingly enough, other film scholars who looked at Arabs or West Asians or Muslims haven't really gone in depth too. I was quite surprised to that extent, because there's been a lot of work done about Muslim and Arab representation, but not very detailed like the way I had done it. And so I needed a kind of like the gel to put all of it together, and critical discourse analysis was the best kind of approach to understand how power and media and Hollywood and identity all work together. And so I decided to use Van Dijk's kind of approach to critical discourse analysis. And that helped me a lot to kind of dissect historical context, as we were discussing, spatial and temporal, of all of these identities within Hollywood and within the culture. Because when I was analyzing it, I was analyzing Hollywood's representation against US foreign policy. So when the president of America, be it Obama or Bush, whoever at that time, mentions Afghan identities, how are they being depicted in the films of that period? And so Edward Said was very important in the understanding of, well, where do I start with, which parts do I pick out? And his work, I think is still so much more relevant, where it's become more nuanced Orientalism, where Orientalism still exists, of how how the US, in the position of power, sees the East, but it's become more nuanced. So for example, instead of very, blatant forms of, let's say, racism, it may be more nuanced racism, and I'll explain what I mean when I get to the case studies. So it's become a little bit more sophisticated, as opposed to like before, where it used to be colonizing with their own military the lands. Now it's like they step back, they put people that align with them in power that are from that land, but they do the bidding for the hegemonic powers of US and Europe. So that's the kind of new Orientalism that we're looking at now in a lot of the films, especially after 2001, where the New York terrorist attacks happened. Films became a little bit more sophisticated. And with Orientalism, where he looked at Islam and Arabs, it's such a, you find that it's such a complicated, it's complicated and it's not complicated, in the sense that Islam is racialized, as opposed to Islam isn't a race. It's just a religious system that you can subscribe to from whatever background you have. But because the way it has entered UK or has entered America, so in the UK, if Islam predominantly is associated with the Indo-Pakistani community, or later on when Egyptians came, or later on when Iraqis came. So it's the identification of Islam with a race or a group of people. And so that, and we see that sometimes someone's depicted in films through Hollywood films through their race, but also there's the undertone of religion as well. Because a lot of the time, everybody thinks all Arabs, for example, are Muslim and all Muslims are Arabs. And so I think Joseph Nye's work that the whole concept of soft power is important, because it underlines this whole idea of Hollywood and colonialism, because colonialism takes Hollywood and its benefits to try and promote itself. So the powers take this idea of Hollywood kind of like humanizing America or its approach, and how Pentagon controls films that want to have access to Pentagon resources. When Iron Man, before it came out in 2008, it had gone through so many changes. The script had completely changed. So he starts out in the original script as someone who's trying to persuade his father to become a pacifist, but by the end of it, because Pentagon has, U.S. State Department, Department of Defense has interfered with the film and Hollywood so much, there's a completely different story where Iron Man is there's no more, his father is the military designer and he's the pacifist. He's the military designer. It's completely changed. So the soft power of the US soft power has managed to infiltrate Hollywood to such an extent where people don't realize the difference. And it's been so successful at its filtration. And so one of the first case study, Afghanistan. So out of the 13 films, there was only 4 that depicted on an essential level. So that's 50%, right? Iron Man, Kite Runner. How many? That's more than 4. My apologies. 7. 50% on level 4. 7. Only 2 films depicted positive traits of Afghan female characters. And so there's this US State Department position of promoting women's rights, human rights, and also women's rights in Afghanistan. However, Hollywood is not reflecting that aspect of US foreign policy. But when it comes to Afghans being depicted as terrorists, 50% of the films depict that. So there is a correlation, but not in everything, right? So then do we see the difference in Orientalism there, where people of the East, specifically women, are seen as needing saving? But then if they do, is that reflected in the films? But then you have also 8 films or 57% that show positive traits of Afghan men. So then that's where the neo-Orientalism case comes in, where it's not as black and white as we think, where it's, always negative and bad. There's this sophisticated interpretation. Iran, 17 films, I believe it was. So 4 films depict level 4. 3 films depict positive traits. And what was interesting is those 3 films, what do I mean by positive traits? So there's 3 films. In the 3 films, there are 3 female identities that are portrayed as positive, in a positive way, are people who help Americans. So in Argo, the maid who is assisting the Americans to be hidden from the Secret Service, she's the only female character that's shown as positive. The interesting fact was, when I researched, the maid actually wasn't even Iranian in real life. She was Filipino, right? So artistic, what do you call it? Changes. So the other one was Not Without My Daughter, 1991. The lady who assists Betty Mahmoudi, the character who wants to escape Iran, she's also the other positive character. And there was another film, I can't remember top of my head. So they're always someone who's supporting American cause, US cause, against Iran. Those are the only characters that are shown positively. Again, 41% of films depict Iranians in acts of terrorism or terroristic ways or so forth and so on. And 6% show. Funnily enough, I was expecting more negative representation of Iranians in the films that fell into my kind of units that I was coding. However, it wasn't straightforward, but you still leave the film, or all of the films, there's some negative aspects about Iran. So it's really a sophisticated way of presenting Americans' foreign policy through the films. The country that really was like so blatantly just US foreign policy was Iraq. So you had only 3 films that depicted level 4. And actually, one of the best films out of all of the films I saw that provided the most nuance, most accurate, most effort to try and balance everything was Three Kings from 1991. And that's, I don't have a teaching position, but if I had a teaching position and I wanted to teach the kind of odd one out of Hollywood where they actually make an attempt to try and show something in a nuanced way, would be Three Kings. Because in Three Kings, you see the film depicting Iraq at the time when Saddam was weakened and it was about to be uprising in 1991. And so the Shias, who were being oppressed, were about to kind of, try and take revenge on Saddam for all the cruelty he had committed for the last 10, 12 years. But then Americans decided to go quiet and step back and let Saddam do what he wanted to do. And that's beautifully depicted in the film. And I'll come back to the reason, one of the reasons why this was so successfully done is because the director made that conscious effort, which most other directors don't bother doing, and I'll explain in a minute why. Out of the 24 films, 83%, 20 films show state in Iraq in a state of war. So you have Cradle of Civilization, where farming started, writing started, and the only thing that you see from Hollywood in the last 30, 40 years is Iraq in a state of war, okay? Funny enough, a lot of the films, actually none of the films were filmed in Iraq. They were all filmed in Morocco and other countries. And so when you're watching it, if you speak Arabic and there's different dialects and Moroccans don't even see themselves as Arabs, they say we're North African. They look different to Iraqis. My wife is Iraqi, they look different, right? However, what they do is they just put the camera there, put the actors there, get Moroccan actors, dressed in Moroccan clothes, different to Iraqi clothes, Moroccan dialect, different to feed them the line, whatever, film it, done. And I'm thinking, okay, I know that Morocco is very good, easy to film and all the accessibility and everything. But surely the director is like, I've got 90, 80, $60 million budget. I can easily fly in 5, 6 Iraqis, put Iraqi clothes on, and just make that tiny effort of okay, film it in Morocco, no problem. Make that tiny effort of making it look authentic. There's just no requirement to do that. And so Palestine had, I think, 14 films, or 13 films, sorry. And the only film that depicts, Munich is the first film that depicted any aspect of why Palestinian believes that's their land and why they're resisting. That's the only time. No other film in the history of the last 40 years gives that effort. And that's interesting because Tony Kushner, who wrote that, he had been to Gaza 2001, 2002. He comes back, Steven Spielberg likes a book of essays that he'd written, and then says, I want you to adapt this novel into a film. And that's the first scene he wrote, where Ali explains to the guy who is a Mossad agent why he believes that, they have a right to resist. So as I said, these three films provide a positive representation. Beast of War, screenwriter, traveled to Afghanistan in the early 80s, experienced Afghanistan during Soviet occupation, and so he had accurate interpretation of what Afghan lives are, wasn't filtered. Three Kings director engages with Professor Shaheen, a very respected scholar, and he said, go and get Iraqi actors, Iraqi refugees, speak to them and get information from them. Director David O. Russell was an activist, so he did that. And Kite Runner is written by an Afghan, Khalid Hosseini, and so he had incorporated his experiences into the film, and the screenwriter and the director wasn't an Afghan director, but you could see that his book and his ideas seep into the film. And so, as stakeholders, as people who are either teaching or producing films, I think it's important that stakeholders are discussed, incorporated into the teaching or into the production of films, and if not necessarily, at least consulted. So these are my recommendations. I'm just going quickly because I only had 1 minute left. These are the recommendations that I give to those who want to teach. Did I have another slide? But I'll go back to this. This formula, I'm trying to promote my formula, really helped me. And I do want you guys to go back, and if you have any feedback so I can improve it, I haven't, it's PhD stage and I want to write to publish it. If you have any feedback, please come back to me and let me know so I can perfect it before I put it out to public. Thank you.